What if everything you thought about power and influence was wrong? What if in one night, an unknown challenger shattered the elite establishment in the most unexpected way? Stay until the end, because what happens in this debate will change everything. The world outside was gray, the sky heavy with storm clouds that never seemed to break. The city moved as it always did. Cars, people, the routine of power churning behind tinted windows and silent, unreadable expressions. But inside a small apartment, the air was still. A single envelope sat on the polished surface of a desk, its weight more than paper, more than ink. Atlas Graves stared at it, his fingers tracing the embossed seal pressed into the thick parchment. The World Leadership Tribunal, a name whispered in government chambers, written in classified files, and feared by those who understood what it truly meant. This was not just an invitation. It was a summons. His breath was steady as he slid a blade beneath the envelope's flap, peeling it open with careful precision. The letter inside bore only a few lines, but they might as well have been carved into stone. You have been selected to defend the future. Atlas's eyes darkened as he read the words again, his mind already running through the implications. Selected? By whom? And for what purpose? The tribunal did not simply invite people. They called upon those they believed had the potential to disrupt, to challenge, or to be crushed beneath the weight of power. He leaned back in his chair, exhaling through his nose. The world had always belonged to a select few, the descendants of kings, the architects of empires, the families who whispered commands and watched entire nations bend at their will. But he was not one of them. Atlas Graves was a man with no legacy, no name passed down through generations of rule, no golden thread of inheritance woven into his fate, and yet somehow someone had placed him on the path to stand before the tribunal. His fingers tightened around the letter. He already knew what this was: a test, a spectacle, a public execution of the unworthy. They had no intention of allowing him to succeed. The tribunal was built on unshakable foundations, guarded by tradition and bloodlines that had endured for centuries. And yet, a slow smirk played at the corner of his lips. They were afraid, afraid enough to bring him in, afraid enough to make him a piece in their game. And if they had made the mistake of letting him step onto the stage, then they had already lost control of the narrative. He folded the letter, slid it back into the envelope, and set it down with the utmost care. Let the game begin. One unknown challenger, one ruthless legend, and an entire world watching. What happens next will leave you speechless. The Grand Tribunal Hall was not designed for comfort. It was built for intimidation. Every inch of its towering structure was meant to remind those who stepped inside that they were beneath it, that they existed only at the tribunal's discretion. Marble pillars loomed over the crowd, their cold surfaces etched with the names of rulers long dead, their legacies still alive in the bones of this institution. Tonight, the hall was filled beyond its capacity. The elite had gathered: prime ministers, billionaire moguls, military strategists, and the unseen puppet masters who dictated global movements behind closed doors. Some watched with quiet amusement, sipping from crystal glasses of aged scotch, their eyes reflecting the golden light of the grand chandeliers. Others murmured among themselves, their expressions betraying mild curiosity. None of them saw a challenger. They saw an obstacle. At the center of it all stood the raised tribunal platform, where the most feared debater of the age waited. Lucian Carter, a name that sent shivers down the spine of even the most seasoned politicians. A man who had verbally eviscerated senators, dismantled billion-dollar CEOs, with nothing more than words, and turned revolutionary thinkers into forgotten footnotes in history. He adjusted the cuffs of his tailored suit, his expression unreadable. To him, this was nothing more than another performance, another opportunity to reaffirm his place as the tribunal's chosen intellectual executioner, and across from him, walking through the towering entryway, was Atlas Graves. No entourage, no security detail, just a man stepping onto the battlefield with nothing but his own mind as a weapon. The murmurs in the hall grew louder as he approached. Some sneered, others chuckled under their breath, amused at the sheer absurdity of it. A nobody walking into the lion's den. Atlas reached the stage, climbing the steps with measured precision. His movements were unhurried, unaffected by the weight of 1,000 stares pressing down on him. Lucian watched him approach, his smirk widening ever so slightly. It was the look of a man who had already won. The moderator stepped forward, a woman with silver hair, sharp eyes, and a reputation as the tribunal's most ruthless enforcer. She raised a single hand, and the hall fell into silence. Tonight's debate will determine the path of global leadership for the next century. Her voice was smooth, but her words carried an iron weight. The question, who deserves to rule? Each side will present their case, and only one will leave victorious. A pause, then a slow, knowing glance toward Atlas. Should he be deemed unfit, his legacy, should he ever attempt to build one, will be erased, his name forgotten, his influence reduced to dust. Atlas met her gaze without flinching. He had expected this. He had walked into this knowing that the tribunal did not simply debate ideas, they determined fates. Lucian's smirk never wavered. Shall we begin? The air in the hall was electric, thick with the weight of expectation. The elite leaned forward, eager to witness the dismantling of a man who did not belong. They had already decided the outcome. What they had failed to realize was that Atlas had decided his own. The underdog is walking into the lion's den. Can he survive, or will he be erased from history? One move has been played, but this isn't just a debate. It's war, and the next words will change everything. Lucian Carter was a master of control. He stood at the podium like a king addressing his subjects, posture relaxed, his expression effortlessly composed. Around him, the tribunal hall remained silent, awaiting his opening move. He knew the stakes, but he also knew the inevitable outcome. This was not a battle. It was an execution. And Atlas Graves was about to be the latest casualty in the long history of pretenders who thought they could challenge the system. Lucian inhaled, then spoke with the authority of a man who had never needed to second-guess himself. Leadership is not a right. It is a birthright. It is earned through lineage, through legacy, through power that transcends time. His voice carried through the chamber like a commandment, measured, unshaken, absolute. The very foundation of civilization was built by those whose bloodlines have endured wars, economic collapse, and political revolutions. Leadership is not for those who simply desire it. It is for those who have been prepared for it since birth. Murmurs of approval rippled through the audience. They had heard these words before. They had lived by them. Their wealth, their control, their dominance. It all stemmed from the belief that power belonged to those born into it. Lucian tilted his head slightly, eyes locked onto Atlas as if studying a curiosity. What we see today, this romanticized idea that anyone can rise to power, that leadership can be granted to those who have not inherited its weight, is an illusion. A pause. Then, with a smirk, he delivered his final strike. You cannot take a man off the streets and expect him to rule. You cannot give power to the weak and expect the world to prosper. The only ones fit to lead are those born to do so. The room erupted in applause. A wave of agreement rippled through the chamber, punctuated by nods and approving glances exchanged between the elite. This was their truth, their unchallenged reality. And yet, Atlas Graves remained still. He did not fidget, he did not glance at the audience for reassurance. He simply watched, silent, unmoved. Lucian took note of it, but he did not dwell on it. It didn't matter, because the moment Atlas opened his mouth, he would collapse under the sheer weight of history and tradition. Lucian had spoken. Now it was time to watch the challenger fall apart. One move has been played, but this isn't just a debate. It's war. And the next words will change everything. Silence stretched through the tribunal hall. The echoes of Lucian's words still hung in the air, like an unshakable verdict that had already been rendered. And yet Atlas Graves did not appear defeated. He reached for the microphone, not to adjust it, not to stall, but with the ease of a man who had already anticipated this moment. His voice, when it came, was steady, unrushed, unbreakable. "You say leadership is inherited." Atlas let the words settle before continuing. "That only those born into power deserve to rule." He turned slightly, scanning the faces of those in the audience who had nodded in agreement with Lucian's speech, those who had clapped, those who had already dismissed him. Yet history disagrees. The air shifted. Atlas took a single step forward, his presence pressing into the space between them. Genghis Khan was a peasant. Napoleon was an outcast. Abraham Lincoln was born in a log cabin. The greatest revolutions in history were not led by those who inherited power, but by those who took it. A flicker of tension cracked through the elite audience. Atlas let it sink in before delivering the next blow. Oh, power is not passed down, it is claimed, it is earned. And that is why the world is changing. That is why the era of inherited rulers is ending. Lucian's smirk tightened. He had expected a plea, a weak argument drenched in emotion, something he could swat aside effortlessly. Instead, he was facing an attack. Atlas continued, his tone unwavering. "The problem with inherited power is that it assumes leadership is something that can be given. But leadership is not a possession. It is a responsibility. It is tested in the fire of failure, in a burden of proving oneself every single day. And that is something no bloodline can guarantee." The murmurs in the audience were no longer purely in agreement. Some had shifted. Some were listening. Atlas turned his gaze directly to Lucian. "You argue that leadership is only for those born into it, but if that were true, you wouldn't need to stand here and convince them of it." Silence. Lucian's fingers curled slightly against the podium. Atlas wasn't playing defense. He was dismantling the foundation of Lucian's entire argument, brick by brick. "You believe in inherited power because it has served you," Atlas said. "Because it has ensured that you never had to prove yourself beyond the privilege you were born into." A slow exhale. Then he delivered the final strike. "But what happens when people stop believing in your bloodline? What happens when power no longer belongs to those who claim it by birthright, but to those who can actually wield it?" The silence was deafening. Lucian's expression remained unreadable, but Atlas could see it. The slight shift in his stance, the weight of an argument he hadn't prepared for. The battle was no longer in Lucian's control. The game has changed. The elite's champion is no longer in control. But what happens next will shake the very foundation of power. Lucian Carter had never felt this before. Not in any debate, not in any courtroom, not in any war of words where he had eviscerated men twice his age and reduced corporate titans to nothing more than stammering, humiliated ghosts of their former selves. But now something in the tribunal hall had shifted. The applause that had once come so easily, the nods of approval, The murmurs of agreement. They were gone. The room, packed with the world's most powerful figures, had turned silent, not because of defeat, but because of uncertainty. Atlas Graves had done something Lucian never expected. He had made them question. Lucian exhaled through his nose, stepping forward, ready to take back control. "Nice words." His voice was smooth, practiced, deadly. "But let me ask you this, Atlas. Have you ever controlled a nation? Have you ever balanced power, war, and economy? Have you ever commanded the weight of leadership? Or do you simply preach from the shadows, hoping for a revolution that will never come?" A flicker of agreement passed through the room. Lucian pressed forward, his words coiling around the audience like a snake. "You speak of struggle, of change, of claiming power. But power is not claimed by words alone. It is seized by those who understand it, who can wield it without hesitation." Lucian's smirk widened, victory just within reach. "So tell us, Atlas, what have you built? What have you commanded? What have you sacrificed?" Silence. Lucian crossed his arms, waiting for the inevitable collapse, waiting for Atlas to reveal that he was nothing more than an idealist standing in the halls of those who had actually shaped the world. But Atlas Graves did not break. Instead, he did something Lucian did not expect. He smiled, and when he spoke, his voice was lower, stronger, more dangerous than before. "I don't need to control a nation." Lucian's smirk twitched. Atlas took a step forward. "Because I control something far more powerful." A pause, a heartbeat, a moment where the entire tribunal leaned in without realizing it. "The people." Lucian's expression froze. The words hung in the air like a weapon freshly drawn from its sheath. "Your power," Atlas continued, "comes from a name, from wealth, from systems built centuries before you were born. But my power comes from those you ignore. The ones outside this room, the ones watching. And they've already made their choice." A ripple of unease spread through the chamber. Some of the elite shifted in their seats, eyes darting toward each other, recognizing something they had not considered. Lucian opened his mouth, ready to retake the floor, but Atlas wasn't done. "You argue that leadership is inherited, but if that were true, you wouldn't need to stand here and convince them of it." Lucian clenched his jaw. He knew what was happening. The control of the room was slipping. Atlas took another step forward, his voice dropping just enough to make the entire hall lean in. "If power was truly yours, you wouldn't need to fight for it." A slow exhale, then the final strike. "The fact that you're standing here arguing for your right to rule means that right no longer belongs to you." Lucian's fingers curled against the podium. For the first time in his career, he had no immediate response. The king has fallen. But what happens next is something no one saw coming. The moderator, sensing the tension, stepped forward. "Lucian Carter, do you wish to respond?" Lucian did not move. He could feel the weight of every eye in the room pressing against him, waiting, expecting him to counter, expecting him to reclaim the throne he had so carefully built. And yet, there was nothing left to say. For a long, painful moment, Lucian stood motionless, his mind racing for a lifeline, a counter-argument, a shift in strategy, anything to pull himself back from the edge. But nothing came. The audience wasn't cheering anymore. They were waiting for him to admit something he had spent his entire career denying. Lucian inhaled, then let out a slow breath. His shoulders relaxed, his fingers unclenched, and then, in front of the tribunal, in front of the world's most powerful figures, in front of the system that had upheld him for decades, he spoke words no one had ever heard him say. "I was wrong!" A ripple of gasps spread across the hall. Atlas did not flinch. He did not move. He simply waited. Lucian turned toward the crowd, his expression unreadable. "Power is changing hands," he said, "and I am no longer the one holding it." The murmurs rose to a roar. Some stood in disbelief. Others whispered urgently among themselves, trying to understand what this meant for the future. The tribunal had never seen a defeat like this, not in its entire history. And Atlas? He simply turned, walking away, because he had already won. Lucian watched him go, arms crossed, his expression unreadable. Then, after a long moment, he spoke again. Maybe I should have asked him for a rematch. The chamber erupted. Some laughed. Some remained frozen in shock. And others realized they had just witnessed history. Atlas Graves had done the impossible. The debate was over, but the consequences, they were only just beginning. The debate is over, but the consequences, they're only beginning. The Grand Tribunal Hall had never experienced silence like this. For years, for decades, it had been the sacred ground where power was reaffirmed, where legacy was protected, where the unworthy were crushed under the weight of tradition. But now, the air was thick with something new, something dangerous. The moment Atlas Graves walked off that stage, the murmurs began. At first, whispers, then voices rising in hurried discussion, in disbelief, in frustration. Some clung to their old beliefs, desperately trying to rationalize what had just happened. Others, the more calculating among them, remained still, processing, recalibrating, because the unthinkable had happened. Lucian Carter had conceded, not just the debate, but power itself. For the first time in the history of the tribunal, the establishment had fractured, not by force, not by rebellion, but by words. Atlas Graves had planted a seed, and it was already starting to grow. From the edges of the hall, reporters, though never officially acknowledged as present, were already dispersing, their fingers flying over devices, crafting headlines that would soon spread like wildfire. Atlas Graves dismantles global power structure in historic tribunal debate. Lucian Carter concedes. Is the old world order falling? Leadership or legacy? The debate that shook the elite. Outside, beyond the stone walls of the tribunal, the world was already changing. Messages were being sent, calls were being made, some filled with rage, with panic, as those who had once held power realized their foundation had been shaken. Others were watching with something far more dangerous. Hope. Atlas Graves had walked in as an unknown. He had walked out as something else entirely. A symbol. And symbols, they don't just fade away. The establishment has cracked. The world is watching. And Atlas Graves, he may have just started a revolution he cannot stop. Far from the tribunal hall, in a city that had long been governed by the unseen hands of the elite, Atlas Graves sat in an empty cafe, his fingers curled around a steaming cup of black coffee. The quiet was a stark contrast to the chaos he had just left behind. The debate was over. He had won. But what did winning even mean? He could still feel the weight of the tribunal's stares, the tension that had filled that hall. He had not given them a revolution, not yet. But he had done something more dangerous. He had made them think. A slow breath left his lips. He knew what would come next. The elite did not sit idly while their power was questioned. They would respond. They would push back. A war of words, of influence, of control had begun the moment he walked off that stage. And Atlas Graves was still an unknown, a wild card, a man without an army, without an empire. But that was the thing about revolutions. They never start with armies. They start with ideas. His phone buzzed against the wooden table. The screen lit up, a single message displayed from an unknown number. We need to talk. Now, Atlas stared at the message, his pulse steady. He had expected this. A counterattack, a challenge, a warning. But what he had not expected was the sender, Lucian Carter. A battle was fought. But the war? It's only just begun. Atlas Graves didn't respond immediately. He sat there, his fingers resting lightly on the edge of his phone, the message from Lucian Carter glowing against the dark screen. Outside, the city hummed, oblivious to the tectonic shift that had just taken place inside the tribunal hall. Lucian wanted to talk, which meant one thing. The elite had already begun their counterattack. Atlas leaned back, exhaling through his nose. He had expected retaliation, a smear campaign, threats, quiet assassinations of character or worse. But a direct message? From Lucian himself? That was something different. His phone buzzed again. "You don't understand what you've done." A small smile tugged at Atlas's lips. "Oh, but I do, Lucian. That's the problem, isn't it?" He tapped the screen, letting the message sit there for a moment before finally replying. "Then tell me." Seconds passed, then minutes. Then, "Meet me. Midnight. Pier 27. Atlas tilted his head, considering. A public place, but isolated enough. No cameras, no microphones hidden behind tribunal podiums. Just two men standing at the edge of power, knowing that whichever way the conversation went, the world would be different when it was over. He set the phone down and finished his coffee. Then, without a word, he stood and walked out the door. The debate was only the beginning. Now, the real battle begins in the shadows. The night was thick with fog. Atlas stepped onto Pier 27, his hands tucked into the pockets of his coat. The dock stretched out over black water, the waves lapping gently against the wooden beams. A single street lamp flickered overhead, casting a pale glow across the planks. And at the far end of the pier, Lucian Carter waited. He was alone. No bodyguards, no hidden operatives watching from the shadows. Just the man who had once been untouchable standing under the flickering light, his hands clasped in front of him. Atlas approached slowly, his footsteps measured, deliberate. When he stopped a few feet away, Lucian let out a breath, shaking his head with something almost like amusement. "You really don't know what you've done, do you?" Atlas didn't answer. He simply watched, waiting. Lucian chuckled softly, but there was no humor in it. "You think you've won, that you've cracked the foundation, that people are questioning everything now." He paused, then took a step closer. "But you forget. Power isn't about who wins a debate. It's about who controls the story afterward." Atlas narrowed his eyes. There it was. The real counterattack. Lucian gestured toward the water. "The tribunal doesn't need to prove you wrong. It just needs to convince the world that you were never right to begin with." Atlas's jaw tightened, but he said nothing. Lucian sighed, tilting his head. "I can help you, Atlas." That caught him off guard. Atlas raised an eyebrow. "Help me?" Lucian nodded. "I'm offering you a seat at the table." Silence. The words hung there, suspended in the damp air between them. Atlas studied him carefully. This wasn't a surrender. It was a test. Lucian Carter was not the kind of man to beg, to admit defeat. If he was extending an olive branch, it wasn't to make peace. It was to see if Atlas could be bought. Atlas exhaled slowly. "And what do you get in return?" Lucian smiled. "Your voice, your influence. You've already lit the fire, why not control how it burns?" Atlas didn't flinch. "And if I refuse?" Lucian's smile didn't fade, but the temperature in the air seemed to drop. "Then you'll watch everything you fought for be erased." Atlas held his gaze, unshaken. Lucian sighed, rubbing his temple as if genuinely exasperated. "I'm not your enemy, Atlas. The people you really pissed off, they don't play games. They don't argue in tribunal halls. They don't send messages." He leaned in. Voice quieter now. They just make problems disappear. Atlas's heartbeat remained steady. Lucian studied him for a long moment, then shook his head with a quiet chuckle. I should have expected this. Atlas tilted his head. Expected what? Lucian smirked. That you wouldn't be afraid. Atlas let a beat of silence pass before answering. Maybe I am. Maybe I just don't care. Lucian exhaled through his nose, then took a step back, nodding to himself. All right, Graves, have it your way. He turned and began walking down the pier, his silhouette fading into the mist. But before he disappeared completely, he called over his shoulder, "They'll come for you now. I won't stop them." Then he was gone. Atlas stood there for a long moment, watching the waves crash against the dock. The battle had been fought. Now the war had begun. Atlas Graves just refused the deal of a lifetime. And now the world's most powerful people want him erased. The real fight starts now. Atlas Graves had barely left the pier before the world turned against him. It started with the news cycle. The headlines, once filled with intrigue and debate, turned venomous overnight. Atlas Graves, a false revolutionary? The dangerous radical who wants to tear down leadership. Tribunal sources reveal Graves may be linked to extremist groups, fabrications, lies. The system was moving swiftly. The tribunal wasn't just countering his message, they were rewriting history in real time. It wasn't enough to discredit him. They needed to make him disappear before his influence spread beyond their control. Atlas sat in a dimly lit apartment, his phone vibrating endlessly with incoming messages. Some from reporters seeking statements, others from unknown numbers sending veiled threats. Then, the real attack came. His accounts? Frozen. His name? Blacklisted. Within hours, Atlas Graves ceased to exist on paper. His bank access? Gone. His apartment lease? Terminated. Every official document tied to his identity was flagged for fraudulent activity. And then came the final message. Run. No name, no sender. But Atlas understood. The tribunal had finished their warnings. Now they were making sure he never spoke again. He grabbed his coat, stuffing what little cash he had left into his pocket. If they were moving this fast, he had only hours before the next phase of their operation began. A total erasure, a staged accident, a quiet death in the night. But Atlas wasn't planning to run, not yet. He had started something, and he wasn't about to let them silence him now. He pulled out his phone, dialed the only person who might still help him. It rang. Then finally a voice answered. "You're out of time, Graves." Atlas clenched his jaw. "Then help me make the next move count." Atlas Graves has lost everything. But if the elite think he's done fighting, they're about to learn just how wrong they are. The meeting took place in the last place the tribunal would expect. A church basement. No cameras, no surveillance. Just flickering candlelight and a room filled with people who refused to be silenced. Atlas scanned the faces around him. Journalists who had been blacklisted for speaking the truth. Tech specialists who had seen how deep the tribunal's control ran. Organizers, activists, even former government officials, all of them exiled by the very system they had once served. A woman with sharp eyes and a steady voice stood up. "You've made yourself the enemy of the most powerful people in the world, Graves." Atlas leaned forward. "Then it's time we remind them that power isn't absolute." The murmurs in the room turned to something more. Conviction, determination. A man in a leather jacket spoke next. "The tribunal controls everything. Media, government, banking. They don't just erase people, Atlas. They erase movements. What makes you think we can fight back?" Atlas's voice was steady. because we're not fighting alone anymore." He reached into his coat, pulling out a flash drive. The evidence, the files that exposed how the tribunal had controlled elections, manipulated economies, toppled governments to serve their own agenda. Everything they had done in the shadows brought into the light. He placed the drive on the table. "The truth isn't enough. We need to force them to acknowledge it." The room was silent. Then slowly, one by one, they nodded. The movement had begun. Atlas was no longer just a rogue voice in the dark. He was leading a rebellion. Atlas Graves has allies. He has evidence. Now he just needs the world to listen. But the tribunal isn't done with him yet. The city was alive with tension. Atlas Graves had spent weeks gathering support, spreading the truth and exposing the tribunal's stranglehold on society. But now they were coming for him. The broadcast was set, a live global transmission that would unveil everything: corruption, cover-ups, the tribunal's darkest secrets. It would be the moment where the world would either rise against their silent rulers or let the system bury Atlas forever. Inside an abandoned warehouse, the underground movement worked in frantic silence. A single satellite uplink had been secured, their only chance to bypass the tribunal's control over the airwaves. If they failed, every trace of their movement would vanish. If they succeeded, Atlas stood by the monitors, watching as the network began linking up. His team, rebels, exiles, truth seekers, worked under the dim glow of the screens. The moment the signal went live, the tribunal would send everything they had to shut it down. Atlas turned to the woman leading the tech team. "Are we ready?" She nodded, barely breathing. "We're in. We go live in 60 seconds. Atlas inhaled. This was it. The world would finally hear the truth. Then, the lights went out. A deep rumble shook the building as explosions erupted outside. The tribunal had arrived. "They're here!" someone yelled. Gunfire rattled in the distance. Vehicles screeched to a halt. Armed enforcers flooded the area. Atlas's heart pounded. They knew. The tribunal had moved faster than expected. One of the rebels shoved a laptop into Atlas's hands. "The signal's still open. We can still broadcast." Atlas looked toward the exit. A choice stood before him: run and survive, or stay and finish what he started. He turned back to the screen, gripping the laptop. No more running, no more hiding. He hit the final key. The screen flickered, and then the truth was live. The tribunal has found them. But it's too late. The truth is out, and now the world must decide. It happened in real time. The video spread like wildfire. News stations, underground networks, even tribunal-controlled media outlets, they couldn't contain it. The truth had been seen. Millions watched as the tribunal's secrets unraveled before their eyes. Governments scrambled, leaders denied. But it didn't matter. The people knew. Atlas Graves had done the impossible, but at a cost. The warehouse was in ruins. Smoke filled the streets. Bodies lay scattered in the wreckage. Atlas had been taken, captured before he could escape, dragged into the depths of the tribunal's highest court. The world saw him last in a dark room, hands bound, his face bloodied, but his eyes unbroken. His voice had been silenced. But the movement he had started, it was unstoppable. In cities across the world, protests ignited. Tribunal buildings were stormed. Officials resigned overnight. The foundation of the old world was crumbling. And then, a final message. On screens worldwide, a pre-recorded video played. Atlas Graves, staring straight into the camera, his voice steady. "If you're watching this, then you already know the truth." He leaned forward. "They wanted me gone. But ideas don't die, movements don't die, and now it's up to you." The screen cut to black. The world held its breath. And then the fight truly began. Atlas Graves disappeared that night. Some say he was executed. Others say he escaped, waiting for the right moment to return. But one thing was certain. The tribunal's reign was over, and a new era had begun. Was this the end, or just the beginning?